The first thing I noticed was the cold, not the room, not the air. The cold spreading across my chest, seeping through the thin fabric of my dress like a slow hand pressing me awake. For a second, my brain couldn't place it. I stood there, holding a half-full glass of water, listening to the soft music and the hum of conversation, trying to understand why my body had suddenly gone still. Then the smell hit me, red wine. Sharp and sour, heavy. I looked down. The front of my dress was soaked, dark, ruined. The wine clung to the fabric, sliding down in thin lines, dripping onto the floor between my shoes. Someone nearby gasped. Another person laughed, the quick kind that comes before someone decides whether to apologize or pretend nothing happened. "I'm so sorry," a woman said, her voice high and light, like this was nothing more than a small inconvenience. I looked up. She was standing close. Too close. Her glass was still tilted, empty. Now, her hand hadn't moved. Her eyes were on my dress, not my face. Her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. For a moment, no one spoke. I waited for her to reach for a napkin, or step back, or look embarrassed. She did none of those things. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and said, "You shouldn't have stood so close." The room shifted around me. Chairs scraped. Someone cleared their throat. I felt heat rise in my neck, fast and sharp, chasing the cold away. My fingers tightened around my glass until my knuckles hurt. I hadn't been standing close. She had walked straight into me, slowly, carefully. I replayed it in my head in the space of a breath, her eyes locking on mine from across the room. The way she'd taken 2 deliberate steps forward. The pause. The tilt of her wrist. This wasn't an accident. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped. Because I saw it then, the look in her eyes wasn't panic. It wasn't surprise. It was calm, controlled, almost satisfied. Around us, the noise picked up again. Conversations restarted in low voices. People turned away, pretending not to see. A few glanced back with curiosity, the way people do when they sense something uncomfortable, but don't want to be involved. Someone handed me a napkin. I didn't know who. "I really am sorry," the woman said again. But this time her voice had changed, softer, louder, meant for others to hear. "These things happen." She finally looked at my face, and smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough. I nodded once, slowly. I pressed the napkin uselessly against the stain, knowing it wouldn't help. The wine had already settled in. The dress was done. "I'll clean this up," I said. My voice sounded calm, steady, almost detached. Inside, something was cracking open. I turned and walked toward the restroom, my back straight, my steps careful. I could feel eyes on me, then feel them drift away. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded final. I stood in front of the mirror and stared. The red stain spread across my chest like a bruise. My face looked pale, older somehow, tired in a way sleep never fixes. I took a breath, then another. I told myself it was just a dress, that none of this mattered, that I could rinse it out, go home, forget this night. But my hands were shaking. I leaned closer to the sink and turned on the cold water, letting it run over my fingers. The sound filled the small space. My reflection stared back at me, silent and waiting. That was when I realized something else. This wasn't the first time, not the wine, not this exact moment, but the way she looked at me, the way she dismissed me, the way she made herself larger by making me smaller. This was familiar, and that scared me more than the stain ever could. I stayed in the restroom longer than I needed to. I dabbed at the dress, blotted, pressed, pretended I could fix what couldn't be fixed. When I finally stepped back out, the room felt different, quieter somehow. Or maybe I was. She was still there, laughing now, talking to 2 people near the window, her posture relaxed, comfortable, like nothing had happened. When she saw me, her eyes flicked to the stain again, then back to my face. Her smile returned. That was when I knew. She thought she'd won something. I walked past her without stopping. I didn't confront her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I took my coat from the back of the chair and slipped it on, even though the room was warm. The fabric brushed against the wet spot, and I flinched as I headed for the door. I heard her voice behind me. "Be careful next time," she said lightly. A few people chuckled. I didn't turn around. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. It hit my face like a reset. I stood under the streetlight for a moment, breathing, letting the sounds of traffic ground me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I stared down at my dress again. The stain was ugly, obvious. There was no hiding it. And suddenly, I wasn't thinking about embarrassment anymore. I was thinking about why she had done it. Why she felt entitled to do it. Why no one had said anything. Why I had walked away like I always did. A memory surfaced then. Not clear, just a feeling. A familiar tightness in my chest. The same one I'd felt in meeting rooms, at family dinners, in quiet conversations where words were chosen carefully to avoid conflict. I wrapped my arms around myself and laughed once softly. It came out wrong, thin, of course, I whispered, because deep down, I already knew. This wasn't about clumsiness, or wine, or a dress. This was about control. I went home and hung the dress in the bathroom, letting it drip into the tub. The water ran red for a long time before it finally turned clear. I watched it like it meant something. Later, I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing my coat, and replayed the night again. Every look, every word, every pause. And something shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. I realized I could name exactly when she decided to do it. The second she saw me. The second our eyes met. The second she realized I was there. That mattered, because it meant this wasn't random. And if it wasn't random, then it wasn't harmless. I didn't sleep much that night. When morning came, the stain was still there. Darker now. Set. Permanent. So was my decision. I didn't throw the dress away. I left it hanging on the back of the bathroom door, where I could see it every time I walked past. The stain had dried into a dull brown red, stiff around the edges. It looked older than it was, like it had always been there. That morning moved slowly. I made coffee and forgot to drink it. I stood at the window longer than usual, watching people walk by, all of them headed somewhere with purpose. I felt like I was still standing in that room, still hearing the glass tilt, still feeling the cold spread across my chest. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big thing, that this kind of thing happened, that people were careless, that I was being sensitive. But my body didn't believe me. My shoulders stayed tight. My jaw hurt from clenching. Every time I thought of her smile, my stomach dropped in a way that felt too familiar. By the time I sat down at my desk, I understood something else. This wasn't about last night alone. Last night had just made it impossible to ignore what came before it. I've always been the one who smooths things over, the one who steps back so others can step forward, the one who apologizes first, even when I'm not sure what I'm apologizing for. It's a role you don't choose out loud. It settles on you quietly, over time, until it feels like part of your skin. Growing up, I learned early that peace mattered more than fairness. My mother used to say, "Let it go. It's not worth it." She said it with good intentions. She'd learned it herself the hard way. My father believed in keeping things calm, even if calm meant swallowing words until they burned. At family dinners, I was the one who passed the plates, refilled the glasses, noticed when someone felt left out. I learned to read rooms before I learned to read people. I learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. That skill followed me into adulthood. At work, I was dependable, always on time, always prepared. The one who picked up extra tasks without being asked. The one who made sure things didn't fall apart. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, that became expected. I didn't mind at first. I liked being useful. I liked being needed. There was comfort in knowing I could keep things running smoothly. But there was a cost. The cost was that people stopped seeing where my limits were. Or maybe they saw them and decided they didn't matter. She came into my life years ago. Quietly at first, we weren't friends. Not really. We shared space, meetings, events, conversations that stayed polite and surface level. She had a way of taking up air, of speaking with confidence, even when she didn't have all the facts. People listened to her. I noticed that right away. She laughed easily. She made eye contact that lingered just long enough to feel like a challenge. When she spoke, she did it with certainty, even when she was wrong. Especially when she was wrong. I told myself not to judge. Everyone has their style. At first, she barely noticed me. That changed when she realized I was competent, when she saw that things worked better when I was involved, that plans went smoother, that details were handled before anyone else thought to ask. She started leaning on me, subtly, a question here, a favor there, always framed as temporary, always delivered with a smile. I said yes, because that's what I did. Over time, her requests stopped sounding like requests. They became assumptions. She'd mention something in passing, already expecting it to be done. She'd thank me afterward publicly, in a way that sounded generous but felt off. Couldn't have done it without her, she'd say, laughing. But when credit was given, it never stayed with me. I told myself it didn't matter. That recognition wasn't why I did things. That I was above that, but small things add up. I started noticing how she spoke to me when no one else was listening. The edge in her voice, the way she corrected me unnecessarily, the way she'd interrupt, then talk over me like I hadn't been there at all. If I pushed back, even gently, she'd smile and say I was misunderstanding her, or being sensitive, or tired. You're reading too much into it, she'd say, and I doubt myself, because that's how it works. Not with shouting, not with anger, with calm voices and reasonable tones that make you question your own reactions. I kept track of it in my body instead. The tightness, the exhaustion, the quiet dread before meetings where I knew she'd be present. Still, I never confronted her. I didn't want to create tension. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she affected me. So I did what I always did. I endured. Outside of work, my life looked steady, simple. I lived alone in a small place that felt safe. I had routines that kept me grounded. Morning, coffee, evening walks, phone calls with my sister where we talked about nothing and everything. She worried about me sometimes. You take on too much, she'd say. You let people walk all over you. I'd laugh it off, tell her she was dramatic. But part of me knew she was right. I was tired in a way. Rest didn't fix. I started waking up at night with thoughts looping through my head. Conversations replayed. Things I wished I'd said. Moments where I felt small and didn't know why. The night of the event had been one of those moments waiting to happen. I almost didn't go. I'd stood in my apartment, staring at the dress laid out on the bed, feeling a strange heaviness I couldn't explain. Something told me to stay home, to avoid it, to keep myself out of her orbit for one more night. But I went anyway, because I didn't want to look weak, or flaky, or like I couldn't handle being in the same room as someone who made me uncomfortable. That choice stayed with me now. As the days passed, the incident followed me like a shadow. People didn't mention it directly, but I could feel the shift. The looks, the curiosity, the unspoken question of whether it had really been an accident. She acted like nothing had happened. If anything, she seemed lighter, more relaxed, like something had been settled in her favor. She greeted me with the same smile, asked me questions in front of others. That put me on the spot, made small comments that sounded harmless but landed hard. Careful, she said once, laughing, as she handed me a cup of coffee. I'd hate for you to spill this too. A few people chuckled. I felt my face heat up. I forced a smile. That was the pattern. She never crossed a line so clearly that others could point to it. She stayed just inside the boundaries of what could be dismissed as joking, as personality, as misunderstanding, and I kept letting it happen. Night, I lay awake thinking about the wine, the way it had soaked in instantly, the way some things don't wash out no matter how hard you try. I started writing things down, not formally, just notes in my phone, dates, comments, moments that made my stomach drop. I didn't know why I was doing it. I told myself it was just to clear my head, but part of me knew better, because for the first time, I wasn't letting it disappear. I was paying attention. The more I noticed, the more I saw how carefully she managed her image, how generous she sounded in public, how supportive, how reasonable, and how different she was when she thought no one important was listening. She had a way of making people doubt themselves without raising her voice, a way of framing things, so she always came out looking calm and kind. I wondered how many others felt the way I did, how many people had walked away from conversations with her feeling smaller, quieter, unsure why. That thought sat heavy in my chest. One afternoon, I ran into an old colleague for coffee, someone who'd left a year earlier. We talked about harmless things at first, jobs, weather, life. Then without planning to, I mentioned her name, just once. I watched my colleague's face change, just slightly, enough to notice. Oh, she said. Yeah, I remember her. There was a pause. She's a lot, my colleague added carefully. Something inside me loosened. I didn't push. I didn't ask directly. I just nodded, and that was enough. It told me what I needed to know. I wasn't imagining things, still. Knowing something and acting on it are very different things. I had spent years convincing myself that staying quiet was safer, that pushing back would only make things worse, that people like her always came out on top. But the image of the wine kept returning, the deliberate tilt, the steady hand, the smile. It hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned. That changed everything, because accidents can be forgiven. Patterns cannot. As the weeks went on, the pressure grew. She began assigning me tasks without asking, speaking for me in meetings, making decisions that affected my work without including me. When I tried to address it, she brushed me off. "You're overthinking it," she said once, her tone gentle but firm. "I thought you trusted me." The word trust hung in the air like a trap. If I pushed, I was unreasonable. If I stayed silent, I disappeared. I started feeling like I was shrinking inside my own life. Simple things became harder. Choosing what to say, when to speak, when to stay quiet. I felt like I was constantly bracing myself. And then there was the dress, still hanging there, still stained. One evening, I finally took it down. I held it in my hands and felt the stiff fabric under my fingers. I thought about throwing it away, about letting it go. Instead, I folded it carefully and placed it in a box at the back of my closet, not as a reminder of humiliation. As evidence, because something had shifted. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't ready to confront her. I wasn't even sure what justice would look like, but I was done pretending nothing had happened, and for the first time, that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. Type. Continue part 3. Continue part 3. The tension didn't arrive all at once. I crept in, quiet and patient, settling into my days like background noise. I'd be answering emails, or walking down the hallway, or sitting in a meeting, and suddenly I'd realize my shoulders were up near my ears, my breathing shallow, my mind already rehearsing responses to things that hadn't been said yet. She was always there, not physically, not always, but her presence lingered in decisions I second-guessed and words I swallowed. In the way I checked my calendar twice before committing to anything. In the way I hesitated before speaking, even when I knew I was right. That's how control works when it's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It makes you do the work for it. After the wine incident, she didn't escalate in obvious ways. She didn't need to. She had learned something important that night. She had learned that I would walk away. So she tightened her grip in quieter ways. She began looping herself into everything I did. Meetings I used to handle alone suddenly had her name added. Emails I drafted carefully came back with her edits, even when no one had asked for them. If I questioned it, she'd laugh softly. "I'm just trying to help," she'd say. "You know how these things can go." Her tone was always calm, concerned, the kind that made me sound unreasonable if I disagreed. Around others, she praised me constantly. "She's amazing," she'd say. "So reliable. I don't know what I'd do without her." People smiled, nodded, took it at face value. What they didn't see was how those words boxed me in. Reliable meant available. Amazing meant adaptable. It meant I would pick up slack without complaint, that I would adjust my boundaries instead of enforcing them. And I did, because part of me still believed that if I just stayed steady, if I didn't rock the boat, things would eventually balance out. They didn't. Instead, she began speaking for me. In meetings, she'd answer questions directed at me before I had a chance to open my mouth. She'd summarize my work in ways that softened my contributions and sharpened hers. If I corrected her, even gently, she'd tilt her head and smile. "Oh, that's not what I meant," she'd say. "But thank you for clarifying." The room would move on. The moment gone, I started noticing how often people looked to her for confirmation, even on things I had led. How my voice seemed to land softer, less certain, simply because I used it less. At night, I'd replay conversations, my mind stuck on the same loop. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you stop her? Why do you always let this happen?" The questions were exhausting. I tried setting small boundaries, tiny ones. I declined a task once, citing workload. I corrected her publicly when she misstated a detail. Each time, there was a response, not anger, not confrontation, withdrawal. She'd go quiet with me, distant, polite but cool. She'd stop looping me into conversations, stop sharing information I needed. I'd find out about changes after they'd already been made. When I asked about it, she'd look surprised. "Oh, I thought you were busy," she'd say. "You said you had a lot on your plate." It was punishment disguised as respect, and it worked. The silence made me uneasy. I'd start questioning whether I'd overstepped, whether I should apologize, whether it was easier to just fall back into place. Most times I did. That was the cycle. Push back, feel the cold, retreat, restore peace. Each loop left me a little smaller. I stopped talking about work with my sister. I didn't want to hear the concern in her voice. I didn't want to explain why I stayed, why I tolerated it, because I didn't fully understand it myself. Part of it was fear of being labeled difficult, fear of losing what I'd built, fear of becoming the problem in a situation that was already draining. But part of it was habit. I had been trained, slowly and thoroughly, to believe that endurance was a virtue, that silence was strength, that being agreeable was safer than being honest. She knew that, whether consciously or not. She played it well. She never raised her voice, never insulted me directly, never did anything that could be easily reported or explained, except once. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else. We were in a meeting, discussing a project timeline. I had prepared the outline. I had sent it ahead of time. Everyone had seen it. When it was my turn to speak, she interrupted. I actually think we should adjust this, she said, pulling up her own version of the timeline. This makes more sense. Her document was nearly identical to mine. The changes were minimal, mostly wording, a shift in order. No one noticed, but I did. She had taken my work, repackaged it, and presented it as her own improvement. I felt something snap inside my chest. I spoke up. That's the same structure I shared earlier, I said, keeping my voice even. The sequence is identical. The room went quiet. She looked at me, eyes wide, genuinely surprised. Oh, she said. I didn't realize that's what you were going for. I must have misunderstood. Her tone was apologetic, warm. Someone chuckled. Great minds think alike, they said. The meeting moved on, but my hands were shaking under the table. Afterward, she pulled me aside. You embarrassed me in there, she said quietly. I blinked. I was just clarifying, I said. She sighed, like she was tired. You could have said something to me privately, she said. There was no need to challenge me in front of everyone. Challenge, the word hung between us. I wasn't challenging you, I said. I was explaining. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's how it felt, she said. And feelings matter. Then she walked away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wall. That was the moment something shifted again, because I realized something important. And no matter how carefully I spoke, no matter how calm I stayed, no matter how reasonable I tried to be, she would always frame my resistance as aggression, my clarity as hostility, my boundaries as betrayal. There was no version of this where I won by staying quiet. From that day on, the pressure increased. She started excluding me from key decisions, passing information through others, asking for my input only after choices had already been made. When I asked why, she'd say, I didn't want to overwhelm you. She'd say it with a smile. I felt trapped in a situation where my competence was used against me, and my silence was expected. The worst part wasn't the work. It was the constant self-doubt. I started questioning my own memory, my own tone, my own intentions. I replayed conversations, wondering if I really had been too sharp, too sensitive, too much. That's what prolonged pressure does. It doesn't break you all at once. It wears you down. One evening, I stayed late at the office, the building quiet around me. I stared at my screen without really seeing it. My reflection looked back at me from the dark glass, tired, older, smaller. I thought about the dress in the box, about how I'd folded it carefully, like it mattered. It did, because it was proof of something real, something concrete, something that hadn't been imagined or exaggerated. That thought grounded me. I began looking back through my notes, the ones I'd been writing in my phone. Dates, phrases, moments, patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, not explosive ones, consistent ones. Control, dismissal, silence as punishment. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with this information. I didn't have a plan. I didn't feel brave, but I felt awake, and that mattered. The next time she made a comment that crossed a line, I didn't respond right away. I wrote it down, exactly as she said it. Who was there? What followed? I stopped trying to win her approval. Instead, I focused on staying clear. It wasn't easy. The pressure didn't disappear. If anything, it became more focused. She sensed the shift. You've been distant, she said one day. Is everything okay? Her tone was gentle, concerned. Yes, I said. I'm fine. She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I held her gaze, for the first time. I didn't look away. Something passed between us then. Not words. Recognition. She knew I was no longer fully under her control, and she didn't like it. That was when I understood that whatever came next wouldn't be quiet, because people who rely on silence fear exposure more than anything. And I was getting closer to something she didn't want seen. I didn't plan the discovery. It didn't come with a clear moment of triumph or a dramatic shift in music. It came the way most truths do, quietly, almost by accident. It started with an email. It was forwarded to me by mistake. I could tell because it wasn't meant to land in my inbox. The tone was different, casual, familiar, the kind of message people write when they assume they're speaking privately. My name was in it, not in the greeting. In the body, she was explaining a delay to someone higher up, framing it carefully, professionally, calmly. She wrote that I had misunderstood instructions, that I had needed extra clarification, that I had caused confusion, but that she had stepped in to steady things. She didn't sound angry or cruel. She sounded reasonable, helpful. I stared at the screen for a long time, long enough for the words to stop looking like sentences and start looking like shapes. This wasn't new. She'd been shaping narratives around me for months, but this time, she'd left a trail. I didn't respond. I saved the email, and something in me finally settled, because this wasn't about proving she was cruel, or malicious, or even wrong. This was about accuracy, for the first time. I stopped asking myself whether I was overreacting. I started asking whether I had proof. That question changed everything. I began going back through my records, slowly, carefully, not with anger, but with focus. Emails where she'd approved plans she later claimed she hadn't seen, messages where she'd asked me to handle something, then later described it as her initiative, meeting notes where decisions were clearly documented, later rewritten in summaries she controlled. None of it looked dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. I printed things out, laid them on my dining table at home, spread them like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was assembling. There were timestamps, threads, clear sequences, reality, preserved in small, boring details. And then there was the wine. I hadn't planned to include it, but I did. Not the dress itself, just the date, the event, the witnesses, the fact that she had addressed it publicly as an accident, while privately making jokes about it afterward. I'd written those jokes down to the time. It felt petty. Now, it felt relevant, because it showed intent. I realized something else as I sorted through everything. I wasn't the only one. Once I started paying attention, I noticed how often others deferred to her version of events, how often people apologized to her, even when she was the one who had shifted expectations. I started listening, more than speaking. People reveal a lot when they think they're just filling silence, a colleague mentioned, feeling confused by mixed messages. Another joked about how she liked to rewrite history. They laughed when they said it, but their eyes didn't. One afternoon, someone asked me quietly if I was okay. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said automatically. They hesitated. You seem under a lot of pressure, they said. I didn't correct them. That was when I realized this wasn't invisible. Not entirely. It just hadn't been named. I didn't go to authority right away. I needed to be sure. Not emotionally, factually. So I kept documenting. Weeks passed. Then one day, she made a mistake, a real one. She forwarded another email. This one included a conversation where she openly discussed managing perceptions, where she described positioning herself as the stabilizing force while letting others take the blame for delays. She didn't use my name this time. She didn't have to. The language was clear. It wasn't angry or defensive. It was strategic. I felt sick as I read it, not because I was surprised, because I finally saw it without the filter of doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch. Documents spread around me, and felt something close to grief. Not for her, for myself, for how long I had accepted this as normal, for how much energy I had spent managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I didn't want revenge, or drama, or public humiliation. I wanted accuracy restored. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my body. I requested a meeting. I kept the message neutral, professional, brief. She replied quickly. Of course, she wrote. Happy to talk. Her confidence didn't waver. I wondered how many times that confidence had been built on other people's silence. The meeting was scheduled with a senior manager present. Someone I trusted. Someone known for listening more than reacting. That part mattered. When the day came, I wore something simple. Nothing that drew attention. Nothing that felt like armor. I brought a folder. I sat down and waited. She arrived smiling. Hi, she said warmly. What's this about? I met her eyes. I want to clarify some things, I said. The manager nodded. Go ahead. I took a breath, then I started. I didn't accuse. I explained. I walked through timelines. I referenced emails. I showed approvals. I pointed out where narratives had shifted and how. I spoke slowly, clearly, without emotion in my voice. I watched her face change, not dramatically, subtly. Her smile tightened. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Her posture stiffened. When I finished, there was silence. The manager looked at the documents, flipped through them, took their time. She spoke then. This feels like a misunderstanding, she said. I think she's interpreting things very personally. I didn't interrupt. I've always tried to support her, she continued. If there's been confusion, that certainly wasn't my intention. Her voice was steady. The manager nodded, then turned to me. Do you have anything else? They asked. I slid the last email forward, the one she hadn't meant to send. I watched her eyes flick down, just for a second, then back up. The silence stretched. This time, it was different, not awkward, heavy. The manager exhaled slowly. I think we need to review some processes, they said carefully, and have a few follow-up conversations. They didn't look at her when they said it. They looked at me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt calm. That meeting didn't end with raised voices or accusations. It ended with a plan, an audit, a request for documentation from multiple people. Structure. Light. In the days that followed, things shifted. Quietly, she became more reserved, more cautious. She stopped speaking for me, stopped assigning tasks without confirmation. People started looping me into conversations directly. The pressure eased. Then came the formal review. I wasn't asked to be present. I didn't need to be. By then, the facts spoke for themselves. The outcome wasn't explosive. She wasn't fired or publicly reprimanded. She was reassigned, her scope reduced, her oversight limited, her ability to control narratives interrupted by process and transparency. She stopped smiling at me, stopped acknowledging me altogether, and for the first time, that felt like relief. One afternoon, weeks later, I passed her in the hallway. She looked at me, really, looked. There was no anger in her eyes, just something like disbelief. As if she still couldn't understand how this had happened. I understood. It happened because I stopped disappearing, because I wrote things down, because I trusted what I saw instead of what I was told to feel. That night, I took the dress out of the box. I held it for a moment, then I threw it away, not because it didn't matter anymore, but because I didn't need it to remind me. The stain was gone, and so was the silence. Type, continue, part 5. Continue, part 5. The weeks after everything settled were quieter than I expected, not empty, just calm in a way that felt unfamiliar. Like standing in a room after a loud machine has been turned off, your ears still ringing, your body waiting for the noise to come back. At first, I kept bracing for something, a comment, a sideways look, some delayed consequence I hadn't anticipated. Nothing came. Meetings happened the way they were supposed to. Emails were clear. Decisions were documented. People spoke directly to me again, without glancing towards someone else first. And no one brought up what had happened, and that was fine. I didn't need the story retold. I didn't need apologies or explanations or validation from the room. I just needed the weight gone. It took time for my body to catch up. Even after the pressure eased, I noticed how alert I stayed, how I still chose words carefully, how I hesitated before disagreeing, even when it was safe. That kind of tension doesn't disappear overnight. It fades slowly, in moments you don't notice at first, like the day I spoke up in a meeting without rehearsing it in my head, or the first time I declined a request without explaining myself afterward, or the evening I got home and realized I hadn't thought about her once all day. Those moments mattered. They told me something important had changed, not around me, inside me. I started sleeping better. Not perfectly, but deeper. I stopped waking up with my jaw clenched, my shoulders lowered on their own. I laughed more easily. People noticed. You seem lighter, my sister said over the phone one night. I smiled. I feel lighter, I said. I didn't explain. She didn't ask. Some things don't need words. At work, responsibilities shifted naturally. Without her controlling the flow of information, people collaborated more openly. Ideas moved faster. Confusion decreased. No one said her name, but the difference was clear. Once, someone thanked me after a meeting. Just a simple thank you. For clarity. For speaking up. I felt a flicker of surprise, then warmth. I hadn't realized how little of that I'd been letting in. One afternoon, months later, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the empty space where the box had been. The dress was gone, the stain was gone, but the memory of it no longer carried heat, or shame, or anger. It felt distant, neutral, like something that had happened in another version of my life. I understood then that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives as balance. As truth placed back where it belongs. As power redistributed quietly, without spectacle. She didn't come after me, didn't confront me, didn't try to rewrite the outcome. She kept her distance. That told me more than any apology ever could. I think, in her own way, she knew. She knew she'd crossed a line that couldn't be smoothed over with charm. She knew she'd underestimated the person who stayed quiet for too long. People like that often mistake silence for weakness. They forget it can also be patience, reflection, preparation. I didn't become someone louder after all this. I didn't turn hard or sharp or confrontational. I became clearer. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't listening. I stopped shrinking to fit into rooms that were already mine. I learned that dignity isn't something you demand, it's something you protect. There are still moments when old instincts rise up, when I feel the urge to smooth things over, to make myself smaller for the comfort of others. When that happens, I pause, I breathe. I remember the feel of cold wine soaking into fabric, the way a single moment can reveal a pattern, the way clarity feels when it finally arrives, and I choose differently, not dramatically, just enough. That's the quiet justice of it. And no revenge, no public reckoning, just truth, placed gently but firmly back in its proper shape, and a life that finally feels like it belongs to me again.